Welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Tiberio, and I'm a Tobacco and Nicotine Intervention Coordinator with the RNAO. RNAO is the professional association for nurses in Ontario and promotes excellence in nursing practice and advancing nurses' contribution to the healthcare system. RNAO has a signature program called the International Affairs and Best Practice Guidelines Center that develops, disseminates, implements, and evaluates clinical and healthy work environment best practice guidelines. One of our best practice guidelines is on smoking cessation, and as part of our cessation initiative, we hold regular webinars to support building capacity among nurses and other healthcare providers to implement and sustain smoking cessation best practices. We want our webinars to be interactive and engaging. We encourage you to type in a question or comment in the chat box during the presentation. For the last 15 minutes, our presenters will address these questions. In the event that we run out of time, our presenters have agreed to respond to your questions in writing. We will also be archiving these slides on our tobacco-free rnao.ca website so that they will be available for future viewing. Our speakers today are Tiiu Sildva and Jennifer Callaghan. Tiiu Sildva is a Provincial Tobacco and Nicotine Intervention Coordinator at RNAO. As a registered nurse from Australia, Tiiu's background includes international health promotion and community engagement, academic teaching, and hospital and community-based nursing since 2008. She completed a Master of Public Health in 2012 and has worked in public health with Indigenous populations in Australia, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Tiiu has also worked at the University of Cambridge in global health and genetic epidemiology research and completed an internship in the Health Promotion and Social Determinants of Health Department at the World Health Organization in Switzerland. Jennifer Callaghan is a Tobacco and Nicotine Intervention Project Coordinator at RNAO. Jennifer completed a Bachelor of Arts with a focus in Medical Anthropology and Spanish at the University of British Columbia. She subsequently completed a Master of Public Health at the University of Edinburgh, where she researched public and patient engagement in health research and focused on Aboriginal and Indigenous health. Jennifer has worked in the Campus Health Program at the University of British Columbia on smoking cessation initiatives and also worked on a UBC research project examining national university tobacco policies. Jennifer also has experience in health equity research at the Centre for Research on Inner-City Health at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. The focus of today's webinar is the important role that cultural competence plays when working with clients in tobacco and nicotine cessation efforts. Culture plays a crucial role in determining how individuals seek out care, so healthcare practitioners must be knowledgeable about identifying the needs of diverse populations. Now let me turn to Tiiu and Jennifer to start the presentation. Take it away.
Thank you, Jennifer. So our objectives today are to define cultural diversity and competence, understand the concepts of culturally sensitive care, discuss the complexities of tobacco control and target marketing, discuss anthropology and ethnography principles related to tobacco use, discuss multiple forms of tobacco and traditional use examples, discuss working with culturally diverse groups in healthcare settings to maintain therapeutic relationships, as well as understanding strategies and tools available to assist healthcare providers to provide culturally sensitive care. So with cultural diversity, it is important to provide culturally sensitive care when working with clients in any healthcare setting. So today we will discuss culture and the importance of maintaining this competence with every client encounter. Culture is characterized by learned values, beliefs, and ways of life that influence an individual's thinking, decisions, and actions in a certain way. Culture encompasses a population and an individual perspective because every person, a wider population, also has individual values and motivations behind their way of life, which are shaped by their lived experiences and environments. So it's important to also recognize the perspective that there is diversity within diversity, not only between cultural groups, but also within them in terms of the individual. Similarly, diversity is the prominent attributes in someone's life that makes a person perceive that they are different from another. Making assumptions or generalizations about a person's health and lifestyle behaviors, as this can lead to stereotyping. Understanding various cultural values can enhance therapeutic relationships with clients and build meaningful and productive discussions. Cultural safety is a related term. It's just around ethics and prevention of discriminatory or more derogatory treatment towards others. So diversity has played an important role in shaping what Canada is today, and we have more foreign-born citizens than any other G8 country with more than 200 ethnic origins and languages. Canada's population diversity is also expected to increase significantly in the next 2 decades, especially in larger cities. So Statistics Canada estimates that just under 30% of Canada's population will be foreign-born by 2031, and just over 30% of Canada's population will belong to a visible minority group. And the vast majority of new immigrants, or up to 80% of them, will arrive from non-European countries. And so neither English nor French will be their first language, and this matters to healthcare professions because these future citizens will access our healthcare systems and receive services from a variety of professionals, many of whom will be nurses. Also, some of these future Canadians will become our colleagues and for future generations. So immigration brings different cultural norms and traditions and different values and beliefs about health and about illness and its treatment, all of which influence their values about healthcare delivery and nursing in particular. So in our multicultural society, it's important to maintain a non-judgmental approach and respect for those different from ourselves. So providing culturally sensitive care. With the fundamental knowledge of cultural competence principles, healthcare providers can provide culturally sensitive care. That is a simple consideration that differences in cultures are worthy of their own right and valuable.
So looking at the complexity of tobacco control as a whole, there are a couple of quotes that illustrate really the magnitude of the complexity here. The first of those quotes says, the cigarette is the most widely distributed global consumer product on earth, the most profitable and the most deadly. Also considering that tobacco is unique in that we're working with the tobacco industry, the second quote says, fighting big tobacco is entirely different from combating most public health problems. Unlike cigarettes, most infectious diseases and maternal and child health problems do not provide profits to transnational corporations and governments. Similarly, most public health problems are not exacerbated by extensive advertising campaigns that promote the cause of the health problems themselves. So, in terms of other disciplines, the question comes up of why we should look to other disciplines. Tobacco, as we said, is a very complex global health issue, and there's no real single discipline that's equipped to address the complexity, especially around tobacco and culture. So the recommendation is a transdisciplinary approach, and transdisciplinary is different from multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary in the sense that transdisciplinary looks at kind of agreeing on a framework and working from kind of a common framework, working on that together. So anthropology is a discipline that has a lot to offer in terms of looking at culture and tobacco. Ethnography is the main data collection method used in anthropology, rather. And ethnography really involves cultural immersion. It's where an anthropologist will work with a group of people over a longer span of time, and it really gets to the deep kind of cultural underpinnings of the society. It can also uncover how factors such as ethnicity, age, gender, socioeconomic status, etc., can influence how an individual or group is exposed and initiated to tobacco in the first place, as well as how they ultimately perceive and affiliate with tobacco use. It can also help us understand how people may be specifically targeted by tobacco company marketing, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Inductive reasoning is used in anthropology, and inductive reasoning is a little different than deductive reasoning, which is typical in the health sciences. Deductive reasoning begins with a hypothesis, which is then tested out. Culture then becomes kind of a measurable quality that cause and effect is attributed to. With inductive reasoning, the hypothesis comes from the investigation itself. And this allows culture to be defined more in the context of what is actually happening in terms of the culture, and it's more of kind of a holistic approach. So what does culture have to do with tobacco use? And really, culture determines the social norms of whether, how, when, where, and why we use tobacco. So it addresses a lot of questions here. In terms of international examples, the statistics, the WHO statistics from China are that right now 52.9% of men smoke cigarettes, while only 2.4% of women smoke cigarettes. And so the anthropologists kind of look to why that may be. Kind of looking at the deeper cultural levels, they found that with men, smoking is a sign of masculinity. And further than that, it's also associated with business and personal development and the concept of having a good life. Tobacco companies have targeted based on this notion, and they've depicted national revolutionary heroes as smokers on the smoking packs or smoke packs for years. So cigarettes are now tied into, they're kind of a measure of male economic success, and they're used in social exchange. So when men meet socially and they exchange cigarettes, it's shown as a sign of respect, of courtesy, and by exchanging cigarettes constantly, they actually create circles of reciprocity that, as you can imagine, will influence addiction as well as prevent quitting attempts. So that explains the male kind of percentage of smokers there. For women, smoking is associated with loose morals, actually, in sex work. So we have a lot lower percentage there, which is tied to the cultural kind of underpinnings. Also in Indonesia, kretek are blended with statement of kretek being considered socio-cultural heritage is an interesting statement, and it really shows how tobacco use essentially is ingrained in the local culture. It holds symbolic meaning. There was an ethnography done in Bombana that looked at kretek and found that it symbolized a host's willingness to accept favors and resolve conflict. It was also used in identity for youth. It was symbolizing masculinity, adulthood, and bravery. So here we have nationalism being associated with tobacco, which can affect legislation and also creates a loophole for the tobacco industry to advertise. In terms of our own culture, it's very important to be aware of our own culture. People may think that they don't necessarily have a particular culture, but culture really is everywhere, and we all have cultural aspects to our lives. Tobacco use in the West has become de-ritualized. So we tend to associate tobacco use more with someone taking a break, getting away, de-stressing, and we may not think that there are so many cultural influences tied to tobacco use. However, there very much are. And as Levi-Strauss, one of the famous anthropologists, has argued, culture can be communicated through symbolism. So in the West, just to illustrate that we indeed do have a culture around tobacco, I'm going to show you some images that will maybe illustrate that aspect a little bit here. So do you recognize this man? And I imagine many of you do. This is the Marlboro Man, and the Marlboro Man was advertised from 1954 to 1999. So he had a good long run of almost 50 years and hasn't been advertised for 17 years. But this symbol is almost universally recognizable still. Even with the younger generations, this is it's an iconic symbol. So the point of this being that these kind of associations of hypermasculinity, independence, maybe kind of solitary time that this image portrays has lived on, even though the tobacco companies cannot market in this way, in Canada at least, anymore. One of the main exposures to tobacco imagery that youth have in North America is through film, actually, to the point that the WHO has called for all countries to introduce age-classified ratings for films with tobacco imagery to reduce this exposure to youth. And the leaders in this movement of reducing this exposure are actually India and China, and 46% rather of the tobacco representation in films is in PG-13 films. So that rating tells you something about kind of the target audience there. A hidden source of imagery is video games, and often in video games you can actually interact. You can light up a cigarette, in this picture sharing a cigarette, and I mean really the point of these is to show you that these images are still prevalent in our culture. The symbols are there, and so this will be affecting your clients in terms of when you're actually counseling them. There are multiple forms of tobacco. This slide is taken from the Tobacco Atlas, and it shows, it's broken it down into smoking tobacco and smokeless tobacco. You can see on the right and left there. There's various forms here. The point of the slide is to really show that there's a variety, to make the point also that these different forms will have different levels of chemicals, they'll differ in levels of tar, they'll also differ in levels of nicotine. And on the bottom, or actually on the left there, you can see the kretek. So those are the Indonesian cigarettes that we were just talking about with the clove. And they actually have double the amount of tar that American cigarettes do. So they're up at 40 milligrams. So also to make the point that in many countries, including our own, there is often issue with contraband cigarettes or contraband tobacco. And as we know, that's an issue in Canada that is being addressed right now. And so looking at the traditional use of tobacco in Canada and just generally worldwide, in Canada with the First Nations and Métis people, there's a strong cultural heritage of tobacco use, which is, unfortunately, which has been largely replaced with non-traditional tobacco use. So the traditional tobacco use, tobacco was involved with ceremonies, with prayers. The focus may not have been so much on actually inhaling the cigarette, or rather the tobacco smoke, but it was used in these cultural purposes. So what has happened in Canada as well as worldwide, the traditional forms of tobacco use have been replaced with non-traditional. So cigarettes have gone in and are causing great problems. The Canadian government, in the First Nations and Inuit component of the federal tobacco control strategy, has specified that they respect and recognize traditional use and will only target non-traditional use. It's also interesting to note that tobacco use is not a traditional practice amongst the Inuit. So again, we can't make assumptions about cultural backgrounds. We need to kind of consider everyone as an individual in this matter. So looking at the anthropological literature, we can come up with some practice recommendations. One of the first steps is to kind of gauge the client's knowledge of the harm that can be associated with tobacco. In the West, we're fortunate to live in countries where we have access to education around the harms of tobacco. We have protective policies in place, and many people are aware of tobacco's harm. However, in other countries, that may not be the case. So initially meeting with a client, it's important to assess how they feel about tobacco and whether they perceive it as harm. This can make sure that if you provide information, you're adding to their knowledge rather than giving knowledge that may be redundant. Also, asking why questions. Why questions are very powerful in that they can ultimately get to the cultural underpinnings of tobacco use. So asking a client, why do you use tobacco, in a non-judgmental way, it may uncover those underlying behaviors and motives. It can be challenging because people aren't typically aware of their own culture. This is kind of common across all cultures as well as our own. So what you can do is, if you are aware of the kind of potential cultural factors of the specific client, you can tailor the questions. So an example would be with Western youth. Knowing that peers are the strongest influence for youth tobacco use, you could ask something like, do your friends smoke? Does this affect your smoking? Also, addiction is something that may be understood in a variety of ways, depending on, again, like we said, the education that the individual has had, and also there are cultural explanations that kind of try to explain addiction. But research has shown that it's very effective for those who are not familiar with the biological basis of addiction to have it explained to them. So that's maybe something that you'd want to consider with your clients. Big Tobacco, they are well aware of all these kind of tactics, and they may be slightly a step ahead of us. Tobacco companies have the ability to actually create cultural elements. They link products with values, and by doing that, they're actually altering social norms. They have control over the cultural landscape, and they produce not just the tobacco, but they also produce that cultural landscape that's necessary for tobacco use. And tobacco companies, as we know, are targeting low-income nations, and they're well aware of this notion in low-income nations that Western products are often seen as prestigious, they're seen as modern, they're seen as cool. And that ties into their approach in those areas. Also, a couple of examples are that there exist industry-employed researchers. So, in the tobacco industry archives, which are these documents released through legal suits, it was shown that, for example, PhD anthropologists have been employed in the past to study how minorities in the United States responded to harm reduction. So this is a small minority of researchers. However, I think we need to be aware that there are researchers that are employed by the tobacco company specifically to find out these kind of cultural underpinnings. An example of very strategic, actually very effective marketing was when the tobacco company marketed menthol cigarettes to African Americans in the context of the civil rights movement. So they were well aware that the cultural themes at the time were around equality, and so they incorporated product equality into their branding. They actually marketed cigarettes as luxury quality items that African Americans had the dignity and right to consume. So they really played into that mindset at the time. They further marketed the cigarettes around themes of fairness and progressivity. So looking at the bigger picture, some considerations that we should have are, it's really important to consider the interpersonal level, but also the community level, the societal level, and the global level, and how these different dimensions interact. Culture is present in all these different levels. And with the client, you can actually try and think more to these larger kind of levels. We need to think not just of individual behavior, but how the government, multinational corporations, and tobacco industry shape tobacco use and behavior. Tobacco products are designed and shaped over time, and over time they become infused with cultural meaning. So this is really the cultural landscape where our clients will start, continue, and or quit their personal use.
Okay, so now we'll go a bit into how to actually work with culturally diverse groups effectively. Pictured here on the left is one of RNAO's guidelines embracing cultural diversity in healthcare and developing cultural competence. These are downloadable online. It's all about considering the social determinants of health, the causes of the causes, and which aim towards an upstream approach, i.e. that's addressing root causes and the notion that better health gains can be achieved when we intervene earlier to prevent poorer outcomes later. This means looking at fundamental structures of social hierarchies and socially determined conditions that we grow, live, work, and age in, as well as the systems in place to deal with illness. We must also consider the wider sets of forces that play a role in how people seek out treatment, such as economic, social policy, income distribution, employment, childhood development, many other things. It is important to recognize the multiple and complex cultural, social, and even biological factors that contribute to an individual's health outcomes and their behaviors. So also genetics is a determinant of health that can play a role in health behaviors in terms of predispositions or protective factors for illness. So it's an interesting area of research that is ever expanding and that we should keep an eye on. So the RNAO guideline here provides recommendations about actions that can be taken to embrace diversity in the healthcare workforce specifically as part of creating a healthy work environment. This BPG addresses notions that minorities, whether they be Canadians of color, First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, physically challenged, etc., still face marginalization in 2016. So it is important to advocate for diversity to be reflected at all levels of the healthcare system, including leadership roles. So the practitioner-client relationship is an important one. As healthcare professionals, we all work with multicultural groups on a regular basis, whether they are colleagues or our clients, so we need to have awareness and respect for those different to ourselves. And when assisting clients in their unique quit journey, we must work with the knowledge that each person brings varying and valuable perspectives to the table. This encompasses an understanding that social and biological determinants of health contribute to their lifestyle choices and that they are complex and interconnected. So age, gender, lived experiences, and education, particularly of both the practitioner and the client, have an impact on these interactions. So we bring our preconceived notions and values to every interaction, and so we need to avoid ethnocentrism, which is judging another culture solely by comparing their values to your own, and then we can avoid assumptions that may cloud our clinical or professional judgment. Fear of confrontation or lack of experience or knowledge about these factors can be barriers to creating a therapeutic practitioner-client relationship, and this will prevent ultimately culturally sensitive care planning. So what kind of tools can we use to ensure that we are providing appropriate care? First, with every encounter, we must acknowledge that smoking is a chronic condition that needs repeated intervention. No matter where a person is from, nicotine addiction follows an expected biological and chemical trajectory. The addictiveness means smokers often need to make several attempts to quit before they are successful. Research shows that it can take up to 30 quit attempts before being successful. So since cultural competence focuses on the skills, knowledge, and attitudes of practitioners, helping tobacco addiction should always be culture-based and non-judgmental. Cessation programs should be designed with contextual relevance in mind, and there's substantial evidence in literature citing long-term benefits with smoking cessation interventions when they're targeted at specific groups, such as youth or women, older adults, ethnic groups, and more. Nurses are actually in a unique position to have access to these populations at all levels of their care. So nurses can play a central role when implementing minimal intervention initiatives. Minimal intervention initiatives are ones such as motivational interviewing, which are part of the recommendations in RNAO's our Integrating Smoking Cessation into Daily Nursing Practice guidelines. So we'll go into motivational interviewing a little bit, and also that point there is about providing a combination therapy to include nicotine replacement therapy, as well as counsel. So motivational interviewing can help gauge a client's views and understandings and cultural underpinnings. When it's done correctly, it will take a naturally cultural relativistic approach. It enables change to occur on the client's terms when they are ready, within the realms of their own culture and their own framework. There are other tools just worth mentioning that exist to use with clients, such as the Fagerstrom test, motivational continuum, a readiness ruler, a decisional balance sheet, which weighs pros and cons, or creating a simple diary. Motivational interviewing, however, is a major evidence-based practice developed in 1983 by William Miller. This was based from his experiences in treating problem drinkers, and it's now used across all substance use disorders. It's a collaborative, person-centered form of guiding to build respectful rapport with the client, so focusing on resolving feelings of ambivalence. So it centers on finding motivational processes within that individual to instigate change and change talk and change thinking. It doesn't try to impose or coerce. It simply supports change in line with the person's stage of readiness. And to emphasize again, it's about the client's personal choice and control. So there are 5 principles in motivational interviewing to be aware of, and they're simply to avoid arguing, express empathy, develop discrepancy, roll with resistance, and support self-efficacy. The goal is to move a person towards eliciting this change talk, and also through using the ORS model, which stands for open-ended questioning. So instead of asking yes or no questions, opening with how, why, what, affirming those and it is due to constant demographic changes in society. It highlights the importance of addressing racial and ethnic disparities in health and healthcare. A framework like this, or organizational, structural, and clinical cultural competence interventions, can help reduce these disparities and improve care ultimately. So this builds on and is compatible with motivational interviewing ideas. So remember that your negotiations with a client through their quit journey may extend beyond the patient to the caregivers and, of course, the client's family. So negotiations should seek to find a solution that's agreeable to everyone who is involved in the plan of care. So, So just to follow on from the ethnic framework, in terms of motivational interviewing, the principles of avoiding arguing, expressing empathy, developing discrepancy, and rolling with resistance, as well as supporting self-efficacy, are all in line with this ethnic framework. It's important to emphasize personal choice and control, and ways in which you can do so is asking questions such as, or statements saying, yes, it may be that you're not ready to quit, but it's entirely your choice, it's up to you, and leaving it at that. For expressing empathy, you can let the client know that he or she has been understood. So you're feeling angry because your parents made you come here and talk with me today, for example, and you're not even convinced that your smoking is a problem. So you're understanding the client's situation. For developing discrepancy between a client's behavior and their personal values, you can say statements such as, so on one hand, you tell me that you want to be a good parent, but you also mention that you're concerned about the example you're setting for your son by smoking. You need to also roll with resistance and meet resistance with that reflection. So you're saying something like, so you're not sure that you even need to consider changing your tobacco use right now. So the principles of developing discrepancy and rolling with resistance are important in brief cessation counseling. And finally, supporting self-efficacy is about optimism that the client is capable of making the change, building their confidence to start thinking about making change in their lifestyle. You can say something like, I have seen other people succeed before with this exact level of tobacco use. Essentially, any statement oriented towards the present or future, either in the cognitive or emotional realm for the client, can represent as a self-motivating statement and encourage them to make a change. So with a few of these frameworks and tools and awareness of best practice guidelines from RNAO, with knowledge of these simple principles, you will find successful therapeutic patient relations through use of these techniques. And yeah, sorry, Jen will just include some information here.
So in terms of the ethnic frame, the explanation part is really asking the client, how do you explain your illness? Realize people may have different explanations about why they're ill. Treatment is discussing whether they've considered treatment, what options they've considered, and what they would like to do in future. Healers is acknowledging the fact that traditional healers often have a role in, as well as yourself as a health professional, they may be being treated by traditional healers. So it's to determine whether they have sought any kind of advice from traditional healers. Negotiate is to kind of work with the client to discuss what you can kind of agree on in terms of moving forward and how can you incorporate their views as well as your teachings as a health professional. The intervention is actually like the working together, and collaboration is bringing everyone together in terms of the traditional healers and the patient and yourself.
So understanding that cultures vary drastically, and many, particularly Indigenous and Aboriginal cultures, share their culture and knowledge through storytelling, we are going to finish with a success story from practice. So just as a disclaimer here, photos from here on are my own, taken from Darwin, Australia, with verbal consent, and not to be disseminated further, just for educational purposes. Now, pictured here is a map where you'll see Galawinku marked there on Elcho Island, and this is in the Northern Territory, Australia. So particularly, I was in Darwin a couple of years ago working with Indigenous Australians in the NT. So I led here a successful health promotion project around prevention of otitis media, or middle ear disease. Based in Darwin, I frequently flew to Elcho Island, which is the northeast corner there of Arnhem Land, NT. The island is 55 kilometers long and 6 kilometers across. It's surrounded by the west side by Arafura Sea, and on the east there by the Cadell Strait. Arnhem Land is the term for the large wilderness area in that northeast tip there, which is home to traditional landowners, the Yolngu people, and permits are required to actually visit there. Galawinku is near the south tip there, and it's the main community on the island, and it's the largest Aboriginal community in northeast Arnhem Land. It's the second largest Aboriginal community in terms of concentrated population in the whole Northern Territory, and the map there doesn't even show the entire Northern Territory. It's an enormous landmass. There are many tribal groups on Galawinku, with most people speaking Yolngu Mata language, as well as other language dialects, of which there are about 20 used across the community. But again, most people speak Yolngu and increasingly English as well, and they speak multiple languages. The people of Galawinku retain their tradition and culture as Yolngu people for future generations by strict methods through art and storytelling and education, increasingly in English and Yolngu, to embrace the wider Australian community. Around 2,000 people live on Galawinku, and at any given time, there's probably 50 to 70 non-Aboriginal workers, most often healthcare or social workers. And you'll see on the top there, Manimak Buturu is Yolngu Mata for healthy ears, and we plastered that all over the place when we were doing our project, which I'll talk more about. So yeah, next slide there. Just some photos from my experiences there, which I'll go through, and a bit of background on the consequence of otitis media in the area. Otitis media in the Northern Territory manifests as endemic hearing loss, which impacts on language and social learning, and it can flow on to academic underachievement, limitation in vocation, and increased contact with the justice system. I worked with the federal government Stronger Futures Health Implementation Plan, which aims to improve health and well-being of Indigenous peoples in Australia through an integrated hearing health program, specifically for children under 16 years of age. I developed a program to share health messages through art because Indigenous Australians, particularly in this region, have a strong cultural association to painting. I organized the community to come together through the school, artists, the small health clinics, and just passers-by to come together and paint anything they felt at a designated date that took approximately 6 months to plan, and paint anything that they felt had meaning to them in relation to sharing messages specifically about ear disease and the links to healthy lifestyles and preventing illness. We had great discussions and planning and ended up with murals on all 4 sides of a hearing booth, which we have photos of here at the health center. And this booth, which was originally just a white shipping container for many years, we found that after these messages were painted on there, there was a boom in ear check visits, and clinic reported an increase in regular ear health checkups in children specifically. It was a fun, welcoming booth instead of being a stark sort of room, which not many people actually knew the purpose of previously because there was no signage. Since then, this framework of using arts-based health promotion has been expanded to other communities, and it's enhancing the effectiveness of these health promotion, education, and community engagement messages. And as part of this project, a key was to have messages in English and local dialects, so we also began converting the medical diagrams pictured here in the middle into Yolngu Mata as well, which had not been done before, so they were never really used that much. And so it brought the community together, it gave them ownership of the whole project and incentive to be part of, and it was something they were really proud of at the end. And so back to just explain the photos from before, out of interest. So there's a couple there of the flight, which was pretty scary in wet season when it's storming up there, but it's little 6-seater airplanes flying from took about 2.5 hours to get from Darwin to Elko. And on the top right there is myself carrying pandanus leaves, which I collected with the women on the bottom left there, and others as they weave baskets out of them, and they sell them at the art hub. And as well, so my experiences here enhanced, my knowledge of culturally sensitive care, which encompassed listening and involving communities at every stage of planning, implementation, and evaluation of all activities. Giving communities most of the say in their care, enhanced participation and ownership. I built trust through regularly going and connecting with these people. And in the end, it turns out I was adopted by one of the mums on the bottom left there, on the left side. Her English name is Belinda, and they named me, gave me an Aboriginal name, which is Wako Gutjan Bukulakje, And so from now on, if I go back to Elko Island, I can state my name and they can find her through the links from the last name, Bukalapje. So it was a really successful and incredible experience up in Darwin, and it just really consolidates the ideas that involving your client group with every stage of implementation and planning and evaluation is highly effective. So we now have some time for questions if anyone has any. Thank you for listening today. We just wanted to end with a quote. To care for someone, I must know who I am. To care for someone, I must know who the other is. To care for someone, I must be able to bridge the gap between myself and the other. Thank you.
Thanks to you and Jennifer for your excellent presentation. So we now have, as Tiiu said, a few minutes for questions. So just a reminder that if you do have any questions for Tiiu or Jennifer, you can type them into the chat box and we can address them. One question I have for you both is just around the idea of whether it's important. So if you have a client coming in of a particular culture, is it important that we study up on that particular culture in order to meet their needs best? Or is it more applying sort of the general principles that you've touched on today in order to enhance that interaction?
So understanding that healthcare providers are constantly under time constraints, it's not realistic always to study up on all the details of certain culture per se, but it is so these principles that we talked about today are the general principles that apply to all cultures, all populations, and then tailoring to context in terms of finding out more information if you have the time or the capacity to do so is of course more valuable, but yeah, based on these general understandings and acknowledgements of culturally sensitive care and cultural sensitivity and diversity is highly effective.
Great, thank you. Another question that I have is just around whether you would know of any further resources that could be looked at in terms of learning more about the traditional use of tobacco in Indigenous populations.
E-learns, we actually have one specifically about First Nations, Inuit, and Métis populations.
Our e-learns are available online. We actually have 5 e-learns, and the e-learns focusing specifically on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit populations. It's about an hour to complete. It's an interactive web-based learning experience that really takes the provider through. So what we can do is we can include that link to participants if you'd like. They're free of charge and they're a really good resource. Also, the Government of Canada with their kind of strategies has a lot of information on kind of First Nations in terms of statistics. We know that the Aboriginal population tobacco use and smoking is triple that of the non-Aboriginal population. So, I mean, it's definitely a population that's of interest in terms of health promotion as well. So there are many resources.
Yes, and there are other links to other providers such as CAMH and Smokers Helpline who have similar links and educational webinars and information online that's all downloadable. And so through particularly RNAO-wise, our e-learn about First Nations, Inuit, and Métis discusses all of these aspects, including statistics and the 7 grandfather teachings, for example, that they culturally go by on an everyday basis. Great,
thank you. And another question that's come in is, just around the idea of a bit of worry or concern about the risk of coming across as bossy or condescending when engaging in teaching other cultures something. Is there a willingness to promote train-the-trainer methods so that people from the target culture can teach their own people? And Tiiu, I wonder maybe if you found that that idea maybe came up when you were working in Australia.
Yeah, I was going to say, for working with these groups, it was most often me as a coordinator, sort of guiding person, providing advice and information to the communities and being there when they wanted me to, but really was giving them the ownership. So they had taken it upon themselves to choose an elder there who was following up with the community because she could speak the language, she knew the community, she was trustworthy rather than, you know, a stranger coming in such as myself. And that really does make a big difference, and the willingness to participate by communities is greatly enhanced when they have methods like myself, maybe as a trainer, to train the trainer as the local elder to train her community. So that is an important point, and you definitely don't want to be condescending or bossy, and so the idea is to just provide the information, appropriate information in an appropriate way that they can go off and take that information with them and do what they need to do with it, and as well as providing that follow-up and feedback and evaluation of how well that worked, and readjust if you need to as you go along.
And I think generally in public health, the concept of capacity development has been very strong in the literature in the last 10 years or so, and really capacity development, looking at ways that we can't just kind of teach, like the question was asking, but also kind of how we can allow people to kind of strengthen, maintain their own capabilities. So in situations where, you know, a healthcare worker, an anthropologist, an aid worker, you know, if they're no longer present in the community, that those skills and capacity kind of lives on.
Great, thank you. And also reminds me a little bit about the work that Leave the Pack Behind does on campuses around cessation. So providing youth and young adults who are attending a post-secondary institute with the skills and the capacity to provide brief contact intervention and some education and access to resources for peers of their own sort of age and cohort as well. So sometimes that can be a little more comfortable for youth and young adults to maybe engage with or hear the information from those individuals who are going through the post-secondary environment just like themselves. It can be maybe sometimes a little less scarier than going to a clinic to talk about smoking. So in that way, it's sort of individual from that post-secondary culture helping peers to quit smoking. Well, I think that's it for questions, it appears. So I just want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. All of our webinar participants will receive an email from us at RNAO within the next 24 hours or so, and it will link you to a short evaluation survey for this webinar. So once you've completed the survey, you'll then be able to print off a certificate of completion. So we hope that you'll join us for upcoming webinars. Please check our tobacco-free RNAO.ca website on an ongoing basis for a list of upcoming webinars and events. And thank you once again to Jennifer and Tiiu for this afternoon's webinar, and wishing everyone a good afternoon. Bye, everyone.